evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our final lecture in the 1977-78 membership lecture series. This evening, we're pleased to have with us Dr. Lanny Bell, the director of our epigraphic survey in Luxor, Egypt, a new member of our faculty as of last July. This is his first appearance before the membership in a public capacity. And we're very glad to welcome him back from Egypt, which he just left roughly a month ago. Dr. Bell is no stranger here. Actually, he studied as an undergraduate at the University of Chicago and took his A.B. in Egyptology here in the 60s. Afterwards, he went to the University of Pennsylvania and did his graduate work in Egyptology there, and taught in the Department of Oriental Studies in the University of Pennsylvania and had curatorial duties in the Egyptian section of the University Museum. He also directed excavations for the University Museum out in the general area of Thebes in Egypt over a number of years, beginning in 1967. And we considered ourselves very fortunate to get a man combining uniquely archaeological and Egyptological experience to head up our epigraphic survey when the post became vacant last summer. So it's with great pleasure that we welcome this evening Dr. Lanny Bell, who will speak to us on the subject Mummies and Magic, an introduction to Egyptian funerary beliefs and practices. Dr. Bell.
Thank you very much, Professor Brinkman. It is indeed a pleasure to be back to deliver a lecture in this august hall where I heard so many lectures in my own student days. Let's see if I can master this. I think we can go right to the slides now, because we have a lot of ground to cover, as you might imagine. When you think of ancient Egypt, you probably think first of pyramids and of mummies, buried treasure, and tomb paintings of a most diverse sort. Our inquiry this evening will be to try to determine as best we can what the meaning is that underlies some of these very strange but characteristic cultural phenomena of the ancient Egyptians, and what relationships they might have one to another. And we will undertake to do this by examining ancient Egyptian funerary beliefs and practices. Now, remember this photograph, because we will see it again later in its fuller version, and you will notice something more peculiar and by that time characteristic about it. Now, of course, the pyramid is only one type of Egyptian tomb. The elementary part of every tomb, that's what they all share, is that they're basically a hole in the ground where you can stick a body, such as in these earliest simple pit burials in which the bodies preserved only as skeletons are crouching in the kneeling position. The most elaborate royal burials of the first dynasty are those exemplified by the type of burial lettered A in the upper right of the slide. The type of burial at the lower is in fact that, apparently, of the great nobles, the officials who functioned in the court of the kings of the first two dynasties, who were buried in the mastaba type of tomb, which we see in the upper right. Notice of the tomb in the upper right that there is an area inside the courtyard wall, inside the enclosure. You can have a man drawn here for scale, where there are tombstones and an area for the presentation of daily food offerings. This, in addition to the hole-in-the-ground aspect of the Egyptian tomb, is the other major architectural feature which we will concentrate on. Now, all of these tombs of both types are in fact nothing than elaborations of the hole in the ground, as we see in the next slide when we see a cutaway through the elaborate niche superstructure of the noble's tomb of the First Dynasty. And there in the middle of the area of the niche, you have the subterranean burial chamber with the where the burial was actually placed in the rock or brick lined room. Now, the typical private burial of the Old Kingdom is the so-called mastaba. Comes from an Arabic word which means bench because of the general bench-like appearance of the superstructures of these tombs. But the mastaba part, the part after which the tomb gets its name, is in fact only that brick or stone structure above ground. The important part of the tomb, the functioning part of the tomb, being the little outbuilding to the left rear, which in fact is the now housed offering chamber. We saw in the First Dynasty royal tomb an area for the depositing of funerary goods. Now we have a little building, a little chapel dedicated specifically to that. And of course, the room, the subterranean chamber at the bottom of the steeply descending shaft, where the body was actually laid to rest. From the mastaba itself, it was a fairly simple, although rather dramatic step to go to the stacking up of mastabas, culminating finally in the true pyramid, going through the stepped pyramid at Saqqara. The predecessor of this sort of stacking up of elements in the superstructure of one of these tombs is perhaps to be found also at Saqqara, the same site where the step pyramid is, of course, located, in this First Dynasty superstructure, where we do get a stepped appearance going up to what in fact would be, if it had been preserved where the Egyptian men are standing, is where there would be the rectangular building which would have been the regular superstructure of such a tomb. We then go, of course, to the first monumental building in Egypt of small, smoothly dressed stones, the great step pyramid of King Zoser at Saqqara, which also, of course, started as a mastaba. You can see in the lower right of this slide where the stones have fallen away from the surface of the lowest step or lowest level of the mastaba. You can see the actual primitive shape of the original mastaba, which was then enlarged until it became the full extent of the lowest step of the pyramid, and then with the adding of the diminishing steps on top, we get the characteristic shape of this early pyramid. The Egyptians described the pyramid in terms of a ladder by which one may ascend up to the heavens. It also seems to represent, as you can see, especially in the smooth pyramids, the true pyramids, those which developed at Giza and later, seems to represent the pinnacle being the sun, with the rays of the sun coming down the four corners of the pyramid down to the four corners of the earth. Egyptian pyramids, as well as obelisks, those tall, monumental, monolithic shafts, which end in small pyramids or pyramidions. Both the tops of the pyramids and the tops of the obelisks were sheathed in metal, either of gold or electrum or of copper, so that the earliest rays of the sun, when the sun rose on the eastern horizon, would hit the top of the pyramid, and the effect of the pyramid would be of the sun shining at the top and shining down on the four corners of the earth. Through a series of disasters, such as the so-called rhomboid pyramid at Meidum, the collapsed pyramid, the Egyptians finally got to the true pyramid. This is the third, or the smallest of the three pyramids at Giza, in many ways architecturally the most perfect, and I show it partly because you can see the little line like little ducks following the mother, the small pyramids, which you normally don't notice when you're at the Giza Plateau. There are all in all some 80 royal pyramids in Egypt. The pyramid is not an isolated and peculiar, it's a peculiar monument, but it's not an isolated monument sitting in lonely splendor on the edge of the rugged desert. In fact, the pyramid is part of a very complex funerary establishment. Notice in the pyramid, as we have it reconstructed here, this is one of the 5th dynasty pyramids, the pyramids of Abu Sir. I'll show you a slide of what they actually look like next. But you see the pyramid itself is surrounded by a wall, the same sort of wall which we saw in the royal tomb of the 1st dynasty. Inside that enclosure where the pyramid itself is, there's one of the baby pyramids, the so-called Queen's Pyramid. The pyramid has on its eastern side, facing the Nile, the mortuary temple, the pyramid temple, where the last rites of the dead pharaoh were performed. This is connected by a long causeway. You see in the middle of the slide the color of the ground changes because, of course, the causeway is actually much longer than that. It's been condensed for the sake of the reconstruction. The causeway, the covered causeway, the ramp, ceremonial passageway leading from the pyramid down to the valley temple, which was accessible during the High Nile when the Nile used to flood, which it did up until 1968. You'll see the reconstruction here done with the Nile in flood, so that ships could actually land right at the valley temple as a quay or pier, and ceremonies for the dead king could be performed there before the body was carried up the ramp into the pyramid temple and finally deposited inside the pyramid itself. This is what the Abu Sir pyramids look like today. This is seen from a distance with the telephoto lens because the area is now a military area and it hasn't been possible to go there. The pyramids after the 4th dynasty Great Pyramids at Giza are generally of inferior workmanship, the rubble cores in many cases being all that's left, crumbling after the smooth casing blocks have been taken away for reuse. Once the pyramid was abandoned by royalty as an element of the royal funerary complex, it was taken up by private individuals. And that's what you see in the cemetery, which my wife and I have been excavating. At the upper, slightly right of the picture, you see a monumental mud brick pyramid. You see a man down on the lower right of the slide to give you a scale. These pyramids are about 20 feet high. The doorway which you see in them is large enough to go through without bending over. They were originally smoothly plastered and whitewashed, and inside were decorated with mud plaster covered with lime, which were representations of the Egyptian god and goddess of the dead. So private individuals of the New Kingdom incorporated the pyramid into their own tombs. That last pyramid we saw was of a very powerful priest of Amun at Karnak. Also in the rather more modest tombs of the workmen in the village of Dar el-Medina, the village which housed the workmen who excavated and decorated the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. Also in their own tombs they incorporated the pyramid. The style of the tomb is familiar. We have the wall around the superstructure. We have the pyramid now, and underground, accessible through the shaft leading up into the protected courtyard of the tomb. We have down at the bottom of that shaft, we have the burial chamber where the body was tucked away in its little coffin, presumably never to be disturbed again. Whatever its form, the tomb was called by the ancient Egyptians the House of Eternity, and it was outfitted by the Egyptians pretty much like an earthly dwelling place. Death was seen by the Egyptians as a continuation of life. The afterworld was a very physical place, and the dead would live there in pretty much the same way as they had in life, with the same needs and wants. In an 18th dynasty tomb inscription, we read, "May I enter my tomb and be able to come out of it again. May I refresh myself in its shadow and drink water from my pool every day. May all my limbs be vigorous, and may I be given food offerings consisting of bread and beer, together with meat and every fruit and vegetable in its season. May I promenade along the edge of my pool unceasingly, and may my soul alight on the branches of the trees which I have planted. May I refresh myself under my sycamore fig trees and eat of the fruit which they provide." And again from another text, "Your life shall begin anew. You shall become a living soul, and he shall have power over bread and water, and shall inhale air. Your eyes shall be given to you in order to see, and your ears in order to hear, with your mouth speaking and your feet walking. Your arms shall move freely, your flesh being firm and your muscles comfortable. You shall take pleasure in all your limbs. You shall examine your whole body and find it perfect with no blemish whatsoever. I only hope you're as comfortable in the audience. The ancient Egyptians imagined some very complex characteristics or features of what we may loosely call the aspects of their personality. And in the next few slides we will examine some of them to finally alight on the one which we wish to concentrate on in this lecture. In this slide, a drawing made from the temple of Luxor, we have a scene from the divine conception and birth of King Amenhotep III, who was, as all Egyptian kings of the time, imagined to be the physical son of the god Amun. In the upper left frame, we have the actual conception with Amun in the guise of the husband of the mother of Amenhotep III and his mother seated side by side on the conjugal bed. In the lower left, the part which we're concerned about, we have the creation of the young king Amenhotep III by the ram-headed creator god Khnum, who is seated before two little standing figures who themselves are standing on a peculiar little table which represents nothing other than the slow potter's wheel. According to Egyptian mythology, the creator god Khnum created man from a lump of clay in just the same way as he would throw a pot. The king is not twins, but rather the first of the two little figures, sucking his finger in a gesture which we all appreciate, is in fact the king himself, and he is being followed by his Ka, a double which has something to do with his ability to eat in the afterworld, apparently, at least by the root meaning of the word. The Ka of a king, and perhaps of certain individuals also at later times, was created with that individual and went through him throughout all of his life and really came into its own in death, as we see in this representation from the tomb of Tutankhamun, where in the far left we have the green god of vegetation, the mortuary god Osiris, being embraced in the afterworld by the young king Tutankhamun, and being followed by his double, or Ka, as we know, by the upraised arms, the two arms on top of the head of the little figure. So we've seen the Ka born with the king, we've seen the Ka go to Osiris with the king. In a papyrus now in the Brussels Museum, we find several other aspects of the personality. On the far right, the black silhouette is nothing other than the shade or shadow of the Egyptian. In a desert country where the sun is, at least until the Aswan High Dam, is always with you, you are very aware of that little thing that follows you around wherever you go. And in fact, in the villages now, I have been told by one of our inspectors, if you trip and fall on your shade or shadow, you must apologize to it when you get up, saying that you've inflicted no harm on it. The black ball at the upper left is nothing other than the night sun, the dead sun, the sun which goes under the earth and which in the process gets all covered with dirt. When the sun rises in the morning, it has to shake the dirt off it. The figure on the left is the body or corpse, the physical, visible manifestation of the individual. And the human-headed bird in the middle, which is what we will be most concerned about, is the Ba, a word which means power, ability to move around, presumably, because this human-headed bird, of course, has the virtues of being human on the one hand and being extremely mobile on the other. In a drawing taken from a tomb of the Greek period, but preserving the Egyptian traditional outlook, we have the four sons of Horus, the little genies that are responsible as the canopic jars for protecting the soft inner organs of the mummy during the embalming process, presenting to the dead man the four aspects of his personality. We can identify the first as the Ka on the right, the two upraised arms, which we've seen already. The second is a rather schematic representation of the heart, which was regarded by the Egyptians as the seat of emotion and thought. Then the little human-headed bird, the ba, and finally a representation of the shade or shadow itself. But it is, of course, as I said, the ba which we wish to emphasize in this very nice relief from a tomb, the tomb of Cha-Nefer, which has been published by the Oriental Institute. The soul in the form of the ba is here seen in the middle of a funerary garden. That T-shaped thing over which it is lying is a pool as seen from above. We get a very good example of the mixture of planes in Egyptian art here, with the trees in their most characteristic view seen from the side as though lying on the ground, which they are not, and the pool in its most characteristic view seen from above. If there were fish in the pool, they would be floating on their sides as though they were dead, which they would not be. The soul, the ba, is coming in for a nice landing in the garden to accompany the body of the owner of the tomb, Cha-Nefer himself, who was depicted kneeling at the right, drinking from the pool itself. Thus, the ancient Egyptian personality consisted of a very complex set of distinct features, of which we have not even covered all, nor do I intend to. The individual's survival, nevertheless, depended entirely on the ability of his soul, the ba, to recognize and identify with the body to which it had belonged in life. Your soul shall not depart from your corpse, we read. And in a text known as the dispute between a man and his soul over the question of suicide, the argument is finally resolved by the soul's plea, desire that you might attain the West. And the West is, of course, the traditional burial ground of the ancient Egyptians, where the sun sets, and the dead buried there would rise in the morning. Just as surely as the sun rises in the morning, they will rise with him. So, desire that you might attain the West when your body goes to the ground, so that I might alight after you have become weary, that is, have died. Then shall we make abode together, and that's the important part. In a papyrus drawing, we have a representation in the upper right of the entrance into the tomb. You see the doorway into the tomb, the facade above it, the frieze of funerary cones. Standing in front of that, upright, is the body of the dead Egyptian, mummified, placed inside its anthropoid or human-shaped coffin. Standing in front of that is the mortuary priest offering a ritual implement to the mouth or face of the mummy of the dead man in order to bring it back to life. In that ritual, the funerary ritual known as the opening of the mouth. Kneeling on the ground behind the priest in an obvious attitude of mourning is the widow of the dead Egyptian, and behind her piled up the offerings which will be deposited in the tomb for his use in the afterworld, including the oxen which will be part of his food as they're being driven by a servant. At the lower right, we see now into the depth of the tomb itself. We see at another stage, we see the body of the dead man lying in the coffin, in the anthropoid sarcophagus. And in the tunnel communicating between the upper world and the realm of the dead, there we have depicted a little ba scurrying down to visit the body of its master as it lies in the underworld. We have the ba in a Theban tomb coming in for a nice three-point landing again. On the anthropoid coffin of the dead man, lying on a funerary bed of the type that, of course, was actually found in the tomb of Tutankhamun. And underneath the bed are 4 jars, which probably represent the 4 canopic urns in which the soft parts of the body were preserved. And finally, from the tomb of Tutankhamun himself, we have Tutankhamun in a small wooden statuette, which was actually in the exhibition here in Chicago, lying on a mortuary bed of the type we just saw, surrounded by 2 little figures representing souls. The king had more souls than anybody else, but the one in the front is the little human-headed bird, the ba, which has now come to communicate with the master. The body had to be preserved in as lifelike a way as possible. And the body now on the slide is perhaps the best preserved of all the royal mummies, that of King Seti I of the 19th dynasty, about 1300 BC, the father of Ramesses II. The earliest mummies were natural, having been dried out simply in their shallow graves, cut in the floor of the Egyptian desert. The sun beating down on these shallow graves simply drew all of the moisture out of the body and preserved them very well. Knew about mummies, of course, because of all the tomb robbery that was going on. Body was scarcely cold and in the ground, and some sly tomb robber had come and dug it out. So the Egyptian cemeteries were, as they are now, simply strewn with bodies, and one could see very well that Grandpa looked pretty good. But then the Egyptians became very sophisticated, partly, apparently, in an attempt to defeat the tomb robbers. It never worked, of course. But they deposited their bodies at the bottom of these deep burial shafts in these subterranean burial chambers. And once they did that, 25 feet underground or more, it was no longer possible for the sun to exert its beneficial work on the body. And pretty soon they discovered that Grandpa didn't look so good anymore, and they had to devise some artificial means of duplicating what nature had done before. We're always having to do that. The process of mummification is very simple. Here's perhaps the, beside for Tutankhamun, and his body doesn't look so great. Here's perhaps the next most famous Egyptian mummy, that of Ramesses II, the illustrious Ramses, who just came back from a triumphant tour of Paris. The Egyptian process of mummification would never have worked had it not been for the dry climate of Egypt. It is in fact the heat of the desert climate which, if the body gets dried in the first place, keeps it well preserved. Herodotus, the Greek traveler in Egypt in the 5th century, describes mummification with a word in Greek which pertains properly to the drying of fish. Egyptian mummies, bodies, when they have had to be shipped across state lines, and even within Egypt, in fact, have been classed as dried meat or dried fish, especially for taxation purposes. The most corruptible parts of the body, and those were for the Egyptians the lungs, the liver, the intestines, and the spleen, were removed from the body during the time of mummification. An embalming incision was made in the abdomen. These organs were removed. They were then subject to special treatment. They were either wrapped up in linen and placed back in the abdominal cavity, or they were placed in these special canopic jars. The god of embalming, the mortuary god, was the jackal-headed god Anubis, who was seen here again officiating at the final wrapping up of a dead Egyptian, lying in his anthropoid coffin on his funerary bier of the type that we've already seen. Now, in the actual funeral ceremonies, it was an Egyptian mortuary priest who was responsible for playing the part of Anubis, and we have an actual mask from the late period that would be used by such a mortuary priest. You can see underneath the nose, you can see in the what should be the chest of the jackal, you can see the eye slots where the mortuary priest could actually have some dim idea of what it was he was doing when he was stumbling around over the body. Now, as we said, Herodotus does describe this process in terms of the drying of fish. Here we have such a representation lying on a funerary bed, surrounded by the 4 little black figures, 2 at the head and 2 at the tail, representing the 4 sons of Horus, the little genies who are responsible for the soft inner organs again. Here we have the an actual set of the canopic jars with the perhaps soft organs inside. Quite often the Egyptians didn't bother to put the organ inside. Maybe it didn't survive the mummification process, or maybe it was just too messy. It didn't really matter. Simply depositing these jars in the tomb and pretending that they had the organs in them would do just as well. Here we have an example of the organs wrapped up and put back inside the abdominal cavity. Then, with the inserting of artificial eyes, we get a rather ghastly and lifelike, in fact, appearance of this mummy dating from about 1000 BC. Mummy was then ready for wrapping up. during the process of which rich ointments and unguents, including some which had at their base bitumen or asphalt, were poured over the body. Partly this was to give the body a good smell, and partly it also solidifies the body. These bitumens were applied hot, and in fact they sear off the upper layers of the skin, but when you go to poke around in the body, you have to use a chisel to get inside. The body was then, after having been wrapped, placed in its coffin and buried in its tomb, whatever that might be, a sand pit, as this one, for a child. The ancient Egyptians learned an awful lot about anatomy from their working with bodies, and we now are learning an awful lot about the ancient Egyptians also from working with their bodies. Here's the largest, as you might imagine, the largest source of ancient bodies anywhere that are other than simply bones. Autopsies are now done on mummies by paleopathologists. We can learn an awful lot about how they lived, what diseases they had, how long they might have lived, and what horrible afflictions they died of. In our excavations at Thebes, we had a paleopathologist, anatomist, and head of the autopsy department of the University of Pennsylvania Hospital come out and work on our bone fragments and attempt to discover as much as they could about the population that we were dealing with. Sometimes the organs are quite well preserved, and as the heart and trachea here, you can put them into formaldehyde, soften them up, section them, stain them, and treat them in exactly the way you would a pathological specimen from a living or just deceased patient. Forensic archaeologists, if we may call them that, are also involved in the whodunits, as in the skull, the very badly battered skull of an Egyptian pharaoh of the 17th dynasty, King Seqenenra, who fell in battle at the hand of the dastardly Hyksos during the great battle for the liberation of the country from the Asiatic invaders. And it has now been possible, by comparing the wounds on this skull, the body lay on the battlefield for some time before it could be picked up and treated. By studying the wounds on the skull, of which there are numerous, it's now possible to identify the particular kind of Syro-Palestinian battle axe which was largely responsible for the demise of this poor pharaoh. Sometimes it didn't work. Either at a period where the Egyptians were experimenting, as this in the Old Kingdom, they hadn't quite mastered the technique, or as in this case from about 900 BC, when this poor individual had the misfortune to be buried on a termite run. You can see in the upper right some of the set of canopic jars that belong to this person, however. So, in order to preserve the human and lifelike appearance of the body, the Egyptians put masks or representations of the features, perhaps idealized, of the dead man or dead woman directly over the wrapped and presumably mummified body. The most famous, of course, being that of the solid gold mask of Tutankhamun, but this was not restricted simply to royalty. Private individuals, we've already seen the representations of those anthropoid coffins, private individuals could have quite passable representations worked in their cartonnage or papier-mâché coffins. The portrait didn't have to be perfect. In fact, the coffin was probably bought off a shelf, but it didn't matter. You added your name to it, and your body or your soul couldn't tell the difference anyway, as long as you had something. This is a practice which continues in Egypt down to the Roman period, and only in Egypt, as this very nice plaster bust of a Roman lady buried in Egypt, set up on top of her coffin with a head sticking up as though she's just about to get up and say, "What's happened here? Finnegan's Wake." Or in the more characteristic style of the encaustic paintings, which were fitted over the face of the dead individuals and wrapped right into the mummy wrappings. Now this is the heart of an Egyptian offering chamber. This happens to be in the mastaba of Ti at Saqqara. There on the floor in the foreground is a large altar or offering table on which the daily offerings would be presented. Daily offerings of various foods and drinks would be presented. And the soul of the dead man would be imagined to emerge from this so-called false door, which was actually originally painted yellow to resemble wood. The soul would imagine to emerge from this false door and partake of the offerings which were presented every day on the altar in front of it. The false door ideally was situated just over or just in front of the shaft going down to the burial chamber so that the ba could fly up there very easily for a quick snack. The food was not eaten, of course, at the end of the day, and the Egyptians were not troubled by this because they imagined that, after all, the soul is very little, it doesn't eat so much, and it was only interested in the essence of the food anyway. The food was carried from tomb to tomb during the course of the day and deposited for various souls to eat, and then apparently at the end of the day it was given to the priests, who took it as part of their salary. Had no essence left, but it still tasted pretty good. The daily funerary cult revolved around the presentation of these food and drink offerings. A mortuary endowment was established by the deceased and intended to be maintained perpetually. But the ancient Egyptians were not unmindful of the dangers of being buried in Egypt, and they were sure that, in fact, the regular delivery of their funerary goods would be interrupted. The funerary endowment itself might fail, or some social or economic situation might develop in which the needs of the living were in every way more urgent, more compelling than those of the dead. Expected filial piety might be lacking, as sometimes happens, or might diminish with the passage of generation upon generation upon generation. And, moreover, the vast quantities of wealth shut away in these desert tombs simply encouraged their plundering and destruction and abandonment. To protect themselves from such eventualities, the ancient Egyptians had recourse to magic, and they devised various magical substitutes for that reality which they feared. Now, it was in the nature of Egyptian magic that the essential part of anything was in its form or outward appearance. If one thing looked like another, it essentially became that thing. In the story of King Cheops and the magicians, we are told of a small waxen figure of a crocodile, which, when thrown into the water, magically became a real crocodile, full-sized, 7 cubits long, that is about 11 feet, which rose up, seized its victim, and carried him off. The representation of a scene, in fact, far from simply recording or commemorating an event, actually created that situation, and the people participating in it. And the ancient Egyptians relied upon this belief to ensure their perpetual well-being. So the tomb owner depicts himself sporting on the weekend in the marshes with his family in a little papyrus boat, accompanied by his wife and by his daughter, even by their pet goose, bringing down with his throw stick fowl. Not only is it good sport, but it's also good for the table. They depict these wonderful scenes of daily life in ancient Egypt, which give us the most exquisite details of the way they did very many things. For them, it was much more important. For them, it ensured that the supply of grain, for instance, as here, which they so desperately needed and wanted, would continue to be forthcoming, even if the mortuary priests and their relatives failed to provide the real thing. Thus we get the usual and monotonous row upon rank, upon register of offering bearers coming into the tomb, bringing all those goods, possessions, and foods which the dead man and his wife might like to eat. We have the representation of the funeral of the dead individual, such as we've already seen, the mummy supported by the mortuary god Anubis, the widow and daughter mourning in front, the mortuary priests who are performing the opening of the mouth ceremony. In front of the tomb, we see the stela showing the dead man offering to the mortuary god Anubis, in front of the entrance to the tomb with a little pyramid on top. This assures them a good burial and, in fact, the requisite funerary ritual. They depict themselves vindicated, coming before the god Osiris. No Egyptian who was anybody ever failed the test. By representing your success, you naturally assure it. They depict themselves having a nice time in their garden of the afterworld. There the dead man and his family drinking water from the goddess of the tree who's pouring water into their cups, while in front of them we get the two little human-headed birds, the bas, also associated with water, drinking from their hands from the water of the pond. And in that slide, which I told you we would look at again, you see even in the scene where the dead man and his wife are playing drafts, behind them, again associated with the tree and drinking water, are the souls of the dead man and his wife. Besides depositing in their tombs the actual burial goods, or the actual goods which they used in life and which they would expect to use in death, they also deposited in their tombs special funerary goods which were very flimsy, hastily made, could never have been used in life, but for all the use you were going to get out of them in the afterworld would be perfectly adequate. Here we have the contents of an intact burial from the tombs at the village of Deir Medina, the people who excavated and decorated the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. We have the anthropoid coffin containing the dead individual himself. We have a bed on which he might lie. We have a little footstool. We have the baskets and jars containing all the funerary goods, the foods which he might like to eat. We also have a harp which he might like for his own musical amusement. In addition to taking the harp with him, he could also, by the depiction, also take the harpist with him, and whenever he and his wife desired a song, the harpist would have to strum his harp. The ancient Egyptians possibly, and it is a disputed point, possibly in the first dynasty, the Egyptian kings killed their favored retainers and took them to the grave with them. Some details of the architecture of the subsidiary burials of the kings of the first dynasty are very suspicious. It looks as though they were all closed over at the same time, and they were all closed over at the time that the king was buried. This is suspect, but it's possible in this very early time, before or about 3000 BC, that this was the case for royalty. The Egyptians very quickly, even if they did do this, very quickly got away from this rather bad habit and saw this apparently as a squandering, a wasting of human resources, and by such devices as this, took their servants without actually killing them. So in their tombs, in the mastaba, the offering chambers, we get these very nice representations again of the servants here slaughtering an ox for the food of the dead man. They're very lifelike. The figure in the middle, who is the master butcher, he is the one with the knife and with the whetstone. He says, according to the inscription above, because we even get their speech recorded, so to be very lifelike, he says to his assistant, "Grab a hold there, get a good hold on that." And the assistant says, "Okay, I'll do it so you'll be pleased." He didn't belong to a union. They deposited these little models characteristic of the period of about 2000 BC in addition to the representations. They could even take their armies with them into the afterworld, as there was strife in this world, so one might expect there to be strife in the afterworld, and the man who went there with his trusty Nubian troops would surely have an advantage. The representation of the squad of Nubian bowmen is in fact quite realistic in that you get men of all different sizes. They're not a single uniform size. It's rather realistic. They deposited very remarkable lifelike statues of themselves, as here a son of King Snefru of the 4th dynasty, depicted with his little mustache, his wife with her very heavy wig, he with his dark skin, he goes out in the sun more, she with her light skin, she's supposed to stay in the house. It's before the days of women's lib. And the famous Sheikh el-Beled, the wooden statue which, when it was excavated, reminded the Egyptian workmen so much of their own mayor. And of course, the little, perhaps the most characteristic of all the Egyptian statues or statuettes, the so-called shuabtis, also called shabtis, also called ushabtis. There's a slight confusion even among the ancient Egyptians as to what these things should be called. Originally they were called the thing made of Persea wood. Later, when they ceased to be made of Persea wood, there was no reason to call them that, so they couldn't remember why they'd been called that, so they changed them to a new word which they understood, which means the answering one. They are inscribed with a spell, which is a spell from the Book of the Dead, which runs essentially, O Shuabti, if the Osiris, the dead man so-and-so, is detailed to do any work which has to be done in the afterworld, whether to cultivate fields or to irrigate land or to transport sand from one side of the river to the other, you shall speak up and say, here I am, meaning I'll do the work, my master can sit and relax, enjoy himself. Originally, these Shuabtis were deposited one at a time in tombs. They were wrapped up in linen and placed in their own little coffins and represented the body of the dead man and served as a body substitute, just as the statues, in case or the coffins, in case the body should be destroyed or rendered unrecognizable, the soul would still be able to come back and identify with the little representation of the dead man. Then they also became associated not only simply with the dead man himself, but also with his servants, as we've seen, the Shuabti spell written on them. Then the Egyptians thought if one Shuabti is good, more must be better, so they deposited up to 400 Shuabtis in a single tomb. Of private individuals, this is. Pharaohs might have much more, but as many as 400 Shuabtis in a single tomb, representing one Shuabti for every day of the year, 365, and because there was great bureaucracy in Egypt, so you expected great bureaucracy in the afterworld, one foreman Shuabti for every 10 worker Shuabtis. In Egypt, to know the name of something meant to be able to control it. In the myth of the secret name of Ra, the sun god declares, "My father thought up this name. He and my mother told it to me, then it was hidden inside my body before I was born, lest any magician be able to use it to gain control over me." The same text proclaims, "A man lives whose name is pronounced." A thoughtful well-wisher could bestow great benefits with a minimum of effort. "The breath of the mouth is beneficial in the necropolis," runs an old text. And in the address to the living, we read, "O you living ones who shall pass by this tomb, may you offer up some of the food which you have in your hands. But if you have nothing with you, may you simply call out, 1,000 loaves of bread and 1,000 jugs of beer, oxen and fowl, and 1,000 of all things good and pure for the soul of this revered one." And so the revered one would be able to eat of the good wishes just as surely as if you left him a sandwich. The spoken word had great power. The Book of the Divine Cow exhorts, "If these words are pronounced by an accomplished scribe, he will be able to go to heaven and come back again. The inhabitants of the West will not be able to withhold water from his mouth. Even the evil deeds which he did on earth," a remarkable confession by the Egyptians that they could possibly do evil deeds. But here's how you handle it. "Even the evil deeds which he did on earth will not be counted against him." The dead are promised that he who utters the spell shall live in the necropolis, and fear of him shall be great. And the Book of the Divine Cow further admonishes, "Beware of these magical spells which their mouths know, for the god of magic himself is in them." The curse of Tutankhamun is, of course, a fraud, a complete fabrication, conjured up by the superstitious, developed in the popular press, and still exploited for profit today. Nevertheless, genuine Egyptian curses did exist, as the following two Old Kingdom examples illustrate. Quote, "I am a fully functioning personality, skilled and completely equipped, one who can read and who knows his spells. As for anyone who shall transgress this tomb, I shall seize him by the neck, as one does a duck, and he shall be held accountable to the great God for it." And my favorite, "A crocodile against you on the water, and a serpent against you on land, if you violate this my tomb." And of course they meant it. The tomb robbers apparently couldn't read. And so in the funerary goods, we have in a carpenter's kit, we have in a little wooden box deposited not only the carpenter's tools, but of course they're not the carpenter's tools themselves. These are too small and too flimsy, and bronze was too valuable a metal to shut away in a tomb at this time, so they deposit tiny models of the carpenter's tools which the carpenter could use in the afterworld. Then inscribed on the box itself, because even this amount of copper or bronze is very valuable and likely to be stolen, are the names of the various tools contained in the kit, which the individual then could use simply by having the name, even if the models were stolen. The dead man depicted here on the left has his servants coming into him, bringing all sorts of cuts of meat, even wild game, the two gazelles on the far right. And above them, just so there's no doubt as to what he intends to have every day, is a so-called funerary menu, the listing of all those items and the numbers, how many of each one he gets every day. This combination of depiction and hieroglyphic writing complements the scenes which we have from ancient Egypt. If we had such a scene as we have here, where on the right, a very important lady at the rear is led by the hand by a very important goddess with yellow skin, we could tell roughly what was going on. She was taking her somewhere. The goddess, by her guise, having the horn headdress on her head, looks very much like Hathor. But of course she may not be Hathor, because all the goddesses start to look like Hathor at about this time. The hieroglyphic text leaves us in no doubt as to what's going on. It tells us specifically that this is the goddess Isis. It says these are words spoken by the goddess Isis, and then what she says, come now, O great queen, Nefertari Marianmut, the wife of Ramses II, that I may give to you a place in the necropolis. And the queen is also specified quite clearly. We know that she has a place in the necropolis and that she is guaranteed this place. She is called the chief queen, the mistress of the two lands, Nefertari Marianmut, the justified before the god Osiris, the great god. So we get what is essentially nothing more than a modern cartoon. All we want are the bubbles over the mouths of the speakers. We get very elaborate developments of this, in which we can see simply by the scene that some very important people are coming in and groveling and abasing themselves and presenting offerings of various kinds. Here's a child on the arm of this man. Here's a very elaborate gold and inlaid bowl in the hand of this man. They're certainly foreigners. They're not Egyptian in appearance. The hieroglyphic legend tells us exactly who they are and tells us what they purport to be doing, and in so doing, whether or not they ever did it, it makes them do it for eternity, because they are bowing down in the presence of the Egyptian king, who would be represented just off in the left outside the picture. The people are identified as the one on the ground is the chief of Keftiu, the Cretans. The one behind him is identified as the chief of Hatta, the king of the Hittites. The one behind him is identified as the prince of Tunep, which is a Syrian city-state. And they are actually, according to the inscription, giving praise to the Lord of the two lands, that is the Egyptian king, kissing the ground, that's what he's doing, for the good God, by the princes of all foreign lands, as they extol his might, the might of his majesty, their tribute being upon their back, consisting of so forth and so on and so on, gold and silver, lapis lazuli, all precious stones, in exchange for the giving to them of the breath of life. That is, they give him these wonderful gifts, which the Egyptians describe as tribute, and he won't smite them. He won't knock their brains out. Now, whether or not, as I said, this ever happened, the Egyptians were able to convince themselves that in this way, and were able to magically control the hostile environment of the foreign peoples around them. Now, hieroglyphs themselves are nothing more than little pictures, as you very well know. And from these three examples, I simply call to your mind the very elaborate detail of the hieroglyphs, and each of the symbols, with very rare exception, can be identified. You can recognize the fish, the birds, the faces, the animals, the snakes, all those little things in the painting of the 18th dynasty. In an inlaid coffin in Cairo Museum, again in glass, but in very great detail. You can practically count the feathers on the wings of the birds. You can see the plating of the baskets. You can distinguish all the details. You have no difficulty in recognizing that these, in fact, are little people and things. And in a painted coffin in the Boston Museum, this is a hieroglyphic inscription. Has nothing to do, in fact, with a man with a stick chasing a bird. A very large bird, in fact. But you can see that each of these is nothing more than a little picture. Hence, being a picture, it had its own existence. The things depicted actually lived, actually existed in some way, and in certain circumstances were potentially hazardous. In burial chambers, they were subject to coming off the wall, man with a stick, very dangerous, coming off the wall and inflicting some injury on the Egyptians buried there. And so certain magical means were taken to neutralize, emasculate, or mutilate the hieroglyphic signs. In the upper two lines, you have the forms of the hieroglyphs as they're normally found. In the lower two lines, the mutilated forms. Human beings are depicted without their bodies. Lion is cut in half. The horned viper is cut in half, or the head is cut off. Crocodiles have knives in them. Bees have their heads cut off. These things aren't going to do anybody any harm. Because the representation had its own existence, you could attack a man, and especially his eternal being, by attacking his representation. And so, in this tomb, on the right, seated before an offering table, which you can still quite clearly represent, and stretching out the arm toward the offering table, as the Egyptians describe the text, is a representation, or was a representation, of an ancient Egyptian man, seated on a couch, still there, beside his wife, who's depicted as though behind him. The Egyptians were very simple-minded about these defacements for the most part, and like children with coloring books, tended to deface within the lines, so you can still see very carefully what was there, but you certainly can't recognize any details. This kind of defacement happened not only to figures, but also to hieroglyphs, not only to individuals, but to kings, not only to kings, but to gods. In this rather wretched inscription in an unfinished tomb at Luxor, this single little patch of inscription was attacked on two separate occasions in ancient Egypt. The name of the owner of the tomb, a certain Senenmut, who had the misfortune of being too closely associated with Queen Hatshepsut when she took over the throne from her young protector, from the young man she was protecting, Thutmose III. When she died, or about the same time, all of his monuments were smashed. The Egyptian agents of Thutmose III came into the tomb, smashed out the name. Of course, they didn't bother to smash out the name of the mother and father, so we could pretty well tell who it was anyway. Besides, again, in a characteristic way, they mutilated the sign within the lines, so we can read quite clearly Senenmut. Then, a little bit later in the dynasty, this was a good time for mutilation, the agents of the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten came in and found the name Amun written here. Now, again, we know the titles of Senenmut. We know that he was overseer of the double granary of Amun, so even if we couldn't read Amun, we could restore that very carefully. But the hieroglyphs are defaced again in such a way that you can read without any doubt Amun. Now, this looks peculiar, of course, because it's an obelisk which has fallen down beside the sacred lake, and I've turned it up for you the way the Egyptians would have liked it. In this particular light, you can see where on the surface of the obelisk, up near the, up in the pyramid itself, up in the pyramid, you can see very clearly how this surface has been cut back. You can see the same treatment there. This is where the name of the god Amun was cut out, and where the figure of the god Amun was cut out by the agents of Akhenaten. Later in the restoration period, in the time just after Tutankhamun, the agents of Seti I and Ramses II came around and, to the best of their ability, put the name of Amun back in, put the figure of Amun back in. The interesting feature here is that the figure of Queen Hatshepsut was not defaced, because Thutmose III despaired of ever hiding this enormous monument of Hatshepsut, so he simply walled it up. And this meant that her figure was preserved. The agents of Akhenaten were not interested in defacing her, so there she is. There's her cartouche quite nicely. In another obelisk of hers, however, Thutmose had his way, and here, where there used to be a figure of Queen Hatshepsut offering before the god Amun, she's been erased and replaced by nothing more than an offering stand. In the myth of the divine king, certain things were expected of every king simply because he was king. But these requirements were able to be satisfied to a certain extent by magic. We shall conclude then with an example of rather blatant royal propaganda and the lesson which it teaches us about the nature of many pseudo-historical Egyptian monuments. In the lovely decorated box of King Tutankhamun, we have a nice representation of him driving his chariot, alone of course. The pharaoh always rides alone, never has a charioteer. Riding his chariot alone, guiding the horses valiantly by the reins wrapped around his waist, and shooting a bow, spending his arrows as rapidly as he possibly can, accumulating quite a pile of dead Syrians in front of him, accompanied in a very minor way by his army. They aren't very significant, they're not very big anyway, they're just bringing up the rear, ready to mop up what he leaves, I suppose. It's extremely unlikely that the young King Tutankhamun, who may have been only 18 or 19 at the time of his death, ever had the luxury to go out and mop up the Syrians. But it was necessary for him to be depicted in this way, again by magic, to ensure his supremacy over the hostile forces around him. Now, this terrible example of what the Egyptians can do with pseudo-historical documents from the mortuary temple of a king of the 25th dynasty, a king Taharqa, one of the Sudanese kings who came up from what was known as Ethiopia, actually the Sudan, and ruled in Egypt as pharaoh from the time of 689 to 664 BC, a representation of Taharqa on the left as a rampant sphinx, trampling down his enemies, clawing at their throats. This is all in, this of course is a fragment, the upper part of the scene is missing. This is in a scene celebrating a Libyan victory of this king, and to the right, just in front of the king, are represented three small persons, two young men, youthful, therefore depicted naked, and a young lady, who are showing their submission to the king by their upraised arms, and they are presumably princelings of the Libyan court, and they are identified very specifically by their names written in hieroglyphs above and around them as Usa, Uni, and Kuatites. So Taharqa, in the first millennium BC, celebrated the great Libyan victory, brought back three very important captives. However, from the time of Pepi II of the 6th dynasty, who ruled about 2279 to 2185 BC, or roughly 1600 years earlier, in the fragments of his mortuary temple, where he depicts his great Libyan victory, one of the fragments preserves three young captives, two young men and a young woman, whose names are written above them, and they are Usa, Uni, and Kuatites. This is a remarkable case of the long life and bad luck of these three people, I think. Now, it's quite a coincidence, I think, that two Egyptian kings should have had two Libyan victories and should have brought back the same three people. However, in the time of Sahura, a king of the 5th dynasty, who ruled approximately 2487 to 2473 BC, or 200 years earlier than the preceding representation, and 1800 years earlier than the first representation. In his representation of his Libyan victory, he shows three young captives that he brought back, two young men and a young woman, and their names are, would you believe, Usa, Uni, and Kuatites. Now what does this mean? Does this mean that any Egyptian king ever brought back three captives named Usa, Uni, and Kuatites? Does this mean that there was in fact an earlier king who did this, and this became part of the royal iconography, and everyone had to celebrate this victory, part of which was the bringing back of these three captives, or did they make up the whole thing? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bell, for a most interesting talk. We will now have a brief reception and refreshments in the Egyptian Hall. Thank you, and we'll see you. The next lecture will be first in the new series, will be the first week of October. The exact time and speaker and topic will be announced in the news and notes. Good night.